But when I rang the doorbell for the first day of work at Maxon, I literally had no idea what I was going to do on that first day or on the second day or on the third day. And so that's sort of how I came to refer to this entire thing as me becoming an accidental CEO. So many people are starting to really dig into 3D as that new storytelling methodology, and I think it's going to make Maxon very successful in the future. My name is David McGavran. I'm the CEO of Maxon. I've been here for 7 years. We're located in Bad Homburg, Germany, which is my second home. I've been in Germany for a total of 15 years. Originally grew up in the United States and moved to Germany for the first time in 2002. So I grew up in the United States, originally from Connecticut in New England. Went to school in Maine for computer science and moved to California for my first job. As I went to university, I actually didn't have any idea what I wanted to do. And I accidentally became a computer science major. The dean of science took me in and interviewed me for a bit and told me I should study computers. And so back when I was in university, I started studying computer science and really enjoyed the art of programming and figuring out how to solve problems. Through a couple changes early in my career, I ended up at Adobe and was able to learn to work on Adobe Premiere Pro, which is a video editing application. I just loved the opportunity to work directly with artists and help them tell their stories better through software, allow them to do things that weren't possible before, and really interactively work with the artists as we developed a video editing software. So when I was in university, I was really privileged to be able to work for this company called ASAP Media Services. It was a student organization that was trying to use computers to tell multimedia stories. This was back before many technologies that we're used to today. And we were able to work with the American Sign Language Organization to create a game to help students learn sign language. And so we were trying to figure out how to mix hand signals and computer graphics together to make an engaging way for students to learn sign language, something that wasn't easy or natural for them. And that opportunity to do something that hadn't been done before, to help people tell stories in a way they hadn't been told before, was really what engaged me. And then through that option, we met a lot of people at Apple, and they introduced us to other people in the industry, and we got to learn all sorts of cool people and do things that no one had done before. So that was probably when my desire to work with artists began. Yeah, so as I was graduating university, it got a little bit bumpy. I was offered a couple jobs at Apple, and I was going to be working in the QuickTime organization, which was really exciting for me. I was going to be moving from Maine out to California. And right before I graduated, Steve Jobs had laid off a number of people at Apple, including the people who were going to offer me jobs. So I needed to quickly change what I was going to do, and I ended up taking a temporary job for a little bit. But luckily, some of those people landed at a company called Claris, which did web page software, which was brand new at the time. And I was moved out to California to work on video editing inside of web pages, or video playback inside of web pages. Unfortunately, Steve Jobs came in and fired us all again. And at that time, I didn't have a lot of extra money, and I wasn't sure how I was going to afford to live in California. But luckily, the best thing that happened was that Adobe looked at the people who had been laid off by Claris and hired up almost all of them. So about 300 of us moved over to Adobe at the early days of the Adobe story. It was a very lucky thing to happen, and I met a ton of great people, and being at Adobe was probably the coolest thing that could happen to a young person in California. So if you were talking about the early days of the internet, the early days of computers being able to do desktop publishing, video editing, photo editing, there was this company Adobe with just a few thousand employees. We worked nonstop all day, all night, but we mixed our life with our work. There was a lot of partying, a lot of fun. The founders were spectacular people. John Warnock and Chuck Geschke, they would come and be with you in your office. I remember in my early days on Premiere, John sat down with me and told me all the things that didn't work in the software. And I was able to program the software just to fix it so that the CEO at the time could use the software. It was a very supportive time. Everybody wanted to do something that wasn't done before. And we had so much fun being in that time of the industry when things were starting to happen. We were meeting amazing people, amazing editors, and storytellers, and we were working directly with them to create technology that didn't exist. So when I first got to Adobe, I actually ended up in the Photoshop team for a few minutes. Didn't last very long until I met the person who was running the engineering organization for, at the time, Adobe Premiere. It wasn't yet considered Premiere Pro. I was hired to work on the Mac version. There was only 4 or 5 of us on the program at the time, and I was the one Mac programmer. And that was a great time. I was young and I was programming nonstop. It was a lot of fun, and I was responsible for the Mac program. Over the time, as Premiere became more relevant to the industry and the product team grew quite a bit, I then became a lead of a couple other programmers, guided some features, developed some major features, and then we started working closer together with one of the other Adobe products, Adobe After Effects. And in that time period where we were working between products, between Premiere and After Effects, and making them work better together, I started to take over large areas of the product. And that's when I sort of got into that first leadership experience where I was trying to design features, work with other people to get the features done, lead people to make these features work better, and also where I started working a lot directly with customers. After that, I went to Germany for a bit and continued that effort. But then as my family and I decided to go back to the United States, they asked me to lead first one of the core teams, which was the media engine, and then shortly thereafter actually to lead the entire engineering organization for Premiere. That's when I had to learn how to step slowly away from programming, maybe doing a little bit less of the direct work. Some of my people that I've worked with in the past might disagree with how much I stepped away. I still felt like I had to be hands-on. But then as I ran the Premiere engineering organization, after a few years, that developed to be running the audio and video group at Adobe. So there was about 4 or 5 different products, about 150 people working together to build the suite of products that Adobe had in the media, video and audio space. That was obviously a lot of change to go from just being a programmer to being a leader of a few people to then leading an entire organization, and then having to have conversations up to the leadership team at Adobe, out into the industry to be interviewed, or to talk to CTOs or large customers, or go meet with lots of people in the industry. So it was a lot of change that happened in maybe 4 or 5 years in that time at Adobe. I think the most important thing that I was able to learn while being at Adobe was what you think you need to add to a product, what you think you need to do to make the artist or the customer happy isn't always correct, and sometimes it's completely wrong. And it's a challenge to learn how to sit with the person who's going to be using your software and actually understand their needs and how to react to them, and not just try to explain to them why what you think is correct. The customer or the artist knows much more than you do as a programmer, and you need to be able to translate what they're saying into the language you need to use to make the product better for them. And it's this really tight feedback loop that was very hard to learn, but I think has mostly influenced where I ended up in my career, was that learning how to work with the customer. As Premiere got more relevant to the industry, we were trying to figure out ways to win more customers. We started off by working first with many of the TV stations around the world. We went around to Europe, to Asia, and went to all the TV stations to help different styles of TV editing use our software. What got really interesting was a decision was made at Adobe to go after a few key filmmakers, directors, and have them tell their stories with Premiere. It was a challenging piece of software to make. We had to step up our game a bit, work harder. But that was when things really got interesting, because when you're sitting down with the best filmmakers in the world and realizing what techniques they need to be able to do to tell their stories, and the standards they hold, and the difficulty it is to make them happy, that's when you realize that a lot of things that you thought yourself, that you believed would be the way to write software, weren't necessarily what they were expecting. And there was such a rapid turnaround time. We were on site with them for days at a time, weeks at a time, working directly with the directors and the editors and the assistant editors to make our software work. The quality they bring to their work, the expectations they have, the need you have to actually deliver for them, or the whole movie falls apart. That's when you realize how important your job is. That's when you realize that you need to pay attention to everything that's going on around you, not just fix a bug here or create a feature here. You need to truly understand what the assistant editor needs, how that interacts with the editor who's going to use the software, what the director expects when he's watching the cuts that you've worked on. Really, truly understanding what the highest expectations are for your software changes the way you go about your job in general, and it changes the way you talk to the people on your team, the way you express what we're trying to achieve, the inspiration you have to give to the people who work with you or for you. You have to be able to explain to them how important it is that things work the way the customer wants, not just what they believe. That, I think, was the point where I realized that I hadn't learned enough up until then. One of the most interesting examples I can remember was I got to sit in while David Fincher was working with his editor to make selects on a TV commercial they were working on. The interaction between David and his editor was something I've never seen before. They were going through 300 shots of someone opening a package of sugar for a perfume commercial, and the quality that they could see in the shots before my eyes can even tell what was going on. I just realized I didn't have that skill set they had at all. But at the same point, there were problems that weren't working correctly during this that I needed to figure out how to fix. That was extremely challenging, to really see people working at the top of their game, and then how you can work alongside them in a different set of things you had to accomplish. So, as I said, I've always loved working at Adobe. It was a great experience. It was 20 years of my life, and I think it's shaped me and introduced me to so many parts of my life that were critical. At the same point, I was living in Germany for the second time, and my children were in school there, and we wanted to stay. And at some point, at Adobe, where I was reaching a level, there was an expectation that I'd be present in headquarters. And so I started to see what else was out there as opportunity. I was mostly thinking about a senior technical role somewhere, maybe a CTO or a director of engineering, something like that, something similar to what I had done at Adobe. And at that time, a friend of mine was recruited to be the CEO of Maxon, not myself. And when I found out that he was being recruited to work at Maxon, I had originally thought it was a US company because we had worked with the US team quite a bit. I didn't realize they were headquartered in Germany, pretty close to where I was living. When I figured that out, I told him to go ahead and take the job, and then he can hire me, and then we can work together again, and we can have fun together at a different company. And I thought that'd be a great solution. So we went through this whole interview process together, and we thought we were going to get the job together, and we were very excited. We actually had a couple schnapps together to really celebrate that opportunity. And at the last second, it fell apart. So we both walked away from the deal. We weren't going to do it. We weren't going to let anybody sort of put us against each other. So we just both walked away from the deal together. And I think two months later, they came back and asked me to be CEO, which was really nothing I'd ever even considered. Something that didn't make sense, or nothing I understood at all. My friend had been a CEO before. He knew that role. I didn't. I then talked to him, and he told me to go for it. And then I told my wife, and she basically told me that I had to go for it. And so I went down to Nemetschek, and they were interviewing me for the position. I told them they would make a huge mistake if they chose me. And so they and my wife and my friend all sort of forced me to do it. And so that's sort of how I came to refer to this entire thing as me becoming an accidental CEO. When I was asked to become CEO of Maxon, I explained to Nemetschek that I actually didn't know anything about that job. I knew how to create a product. I knew how Adobe went about selling software to artists. I knew how we worked with artists to make our software better. I didn't have any finance experience. I didn't have any sales experience. I didn't have any marketing experience. I didn't really have any HR experience, facilities. And so I explained to Nemetschek that I didn't have the tools they needed for me to take this role. They convinced me to do it, and they offered me guidance. I was very lucky. They assigned, who's now our CFO, Enrique Glass, as a partner to me. He was at that time at Nemetschek, and they assigned him to teach me at least the finance piece. But when I rang the doorbell for the first day of work at Maxon, which is also its own unique experience, showing up and ringing the doorbell for your first day of the company you've been asked to lead, I literally had no idea what I was going to do on that first day, or on the second day, or on the third day. Everything that happened for those first few months was unexpected. I didn't expect to be figuring out how to get carpets cleaned, or that I actually sat down and signed people's paychecks. There was the basic things that it takes to run a company aren't things you're thinking about when you're just a programmer making software for artists. After I left Adobe, actually the group I was in had gone through a bit of change, and several of us sort of chose that time in our lives to try something different. So my friend who I'd mentioned before, I had left, joined Maxon. He then actually made the decision to leave and go to Amazon. And so we were both in new roles, and we actually became sort of co-mentors. He was taking this cool new role at Amazon, actually in video as well. And I was over here at Maxon. He's been a great mentor with me throughout. I was actually very lucky, since I didn't know what I was doing, I formed an advisory board for Maxon, and I brought back some of the people I've had a lot of luck working with in the past. There was a VP from Disney who was happy to be a mentor to me. My friend was a mentor to me, and several others. And so I've been able to actually, one of my favorite things about being at Maxon is it's in the same industry as where I was at Adobe. So going back to the trade shows, I get to sit and hang out with all the people that we built our life together in those early years from Adobe. I remember on the day that they announced to Maxon that I was joining the company as CEO and that the founders were retiring. It was a very emotional day for people at Maxon. We had about 2 weeks before I started, and I had rented a car to go on a quick vacation with my family. And I showed up at Maxon in what ended up being a purple cactus. It was a very shiny looking, funny car. And the people there for the announcement saw me driving away in this purple car after the announcement, after everything sort of went well, after everything was sort of fine. And I had to go home and explain to my wife that the first impression that I made on the people at Maxon was me driving a purple cactus to the office, which I guess does, say something about me, because I don't worry so much about those things, but it was a funny experience to explain to my wife that I showed up in a purple car. So when I got to Maxon, we had one product. It was created a long time ago by our Chief Technology and Product Officer when he was 15. It's called Cinema 4D. It's what's called a DCC, a digital content creation application. It's basically designed to create 3D scenes, objects, games, videos, motion graphics mostly for the TV and film industry. However, when it first came out, Nemetschek, which is an architecture company in Germany at the time, they wanted a piece of software that can turn the buildings they make into photorealistic versions of it. So you go from a CAD model to a photorealistic version. Cinema 4D has what's considered renderers built into it, and using that technology to render architecture was what made it very interesting for Nemetschek. So Nemetschek acquired Maxon at the time to bring 3D realistic rendering to architecture software. So at that point it was used for architecture, but it was also used for film, games, TV, motion graphics, product design, etc. In the 3D artistic software segment, there's a number of companies now. It's a very competitive space, and there's a lot of products that in general do the same thing. Each of the companies has sort of carved out their own specialty, and Maxon became very well known and is very well known for motion graphics. And the example I always like to give is if you watch the beginning of any sport program, the World Cup or basketball or football, you're always seeing a trophy spin in or a player come on the screen with all sorts of text and statistics about the player. That look and feel is an example of motion graphics. There's lots of those different things, but that's an example that most people can grasp. And that's what Cinema 4D is used mostly for. It's mostly in the motion graphics space. So after I got into the building and I was asked to pick out my own office, which is also its own unique question, I went to just talk to everybody. I wanted to get to know everybody who was at the company, figure out what they were thinking, what was on their mind. There was concerns about this new person, this person from Adobe, an American, not knowing what 3D software was. It's a related segment to video, but it is quite different. And so I went and I just talked to everybody. And most of the concerns that people had and most of the problems that I was asked to consider or think about when I got there were very far from product. We were looking at how we were selling our software. There was nothing was on a computer at Maxon. There was piles of bills that were sent to customers in paper form so that they can buy the software. There was windows that needed to be cleaned. The offices were too hot because they were using very high power computers without air conditioning. There was dirty carpets. The walls were literally falling down. Things were falling on top of cars. We were having to hire people, change directions, for the building, how to get things to work. Everything wasn't working as smooth as it should be, but almost none of it had to do with making the customers happy because the software was amazing. That part was solved, but building a successful company around it was where the challenge was, and that was what I didn't actually think about prior to becoming CEO. When I got to Maxon, I was extremely lucky that many of the people there had been there for a long time. They knew the company, they knew the people, they knew the products, and they were more than willing to participate in changing the company to something more modern. That meant I had a finance person who was spectacular. I had a human resources partner. I had a programmer, the chief technical officer. I had a great leading team in the engineering sense, and all of them were willing to sit down and help change the company. The most important thing for me was to really truly understand what each person did. I honestly didn't know who or what used Excel. For me, that wasn't a thing. But to sit down and understand finance rules and how do you do finance at a company, if I didn't understand that, I couldn't have done my job correctly. So I actually had to sit down with my CFO and painstakingly have him teach me what IFRS is. Why would you do revenue deferral? Why would you, what are the taxation reasons? Why are we doing cross-border charges the way we do? All of these things I had no idea about, and they influence the way you make decisions in the rest of the product. If you're going to talk about how you sell your product, you need to know how that impacts the finances. And each person at the company who was in their sections of the company was very willing to sit down and work with me so that, as I understood it, we can bring that area into more modern workflows. As far as I was concerned, I thought I was just going to program forever. I loved sitting down in front of a computer and making software work. I loved solving problems for artists. I was often joked about or criticized is that even when I was sitting in meetings as the director of engineering at Adobe, that I would be sitting in meetings and my computer would start making a lot of noise because people knew I was still programming. Until the day I left Adobe, I was still programming to solve problems for the artists that used our software. On the other side, when I got to Maxon, I think our CTO, Philip, made the wise decision to not let me have access to the software. So I actually thought I'd be programming forever. Becoming a CEO was, again, a lot about the opportunity just presenting itself, but it was also about the opportunity to do what was right for my family, to stay in Germany, stay where I wanted to be, but stay in the industry I wanted to be in, which was in this artistic software business. I think it's obvious that when you're a CEO, if you take the time to think about it, that you are responsible for everything, that anything that happens, in some way you have to take that responsibility for. I think what I hadn't realized before, or it even took me a few months to realize, was that actually does mean everything. If someone doesn't get paid, if someone's healthcare isn't working correctly, if someone needs a vacation, if they need support because something's happened in their family, the people at the company, the buildings at the company, the office space, the things that need to work so that the employees can do their job, which is make great software, you have to be responsible for that. And the responsibility for the people at the company, I think, was what sunk in the most, because it's actually quite a lot of work to make sure that everybody can be successful in their career, because it takes a lot just to make sure that the company works well, that people who need help, we all have things going on in our lives, that they can get that support from the company. And putting more effort into that was important to learn, but I think it took more time than I expected. It was a company that had a product that was extremely beloved in the industry. Everybody loved the product, but unfortunately, the company itself, not the people, not the product, but the company itself wasn't running very well. It was left behind, it was still in paper form, and everything needed to change. We needed to do simple things like update the web page, set up a new web shop, sell on the web, which was obvious at the time, but people weren't doing. These were all things that none of us had done before. The people at Maxon had run the company the way it was. They had built the products the way they were. To change the company, to create it to be a modern company, which did things that people expect. They weren't groundbreaking. Bringing out subscriptions at the time wasn't groundbreaking. It was basically expected. But to change the company from releasing a single product once a year to being online all the time, having customers be able to buy the product when they want to, not going through resellers, buying it directly from us on the web. We all needed to change things. And since none of us did it before, I was just a programmer, other people had just done their jobs, I had to dig into every piece of the company and to understand why things matter. Because when you're changing a company like that, if you screw up, you can break everything. And people's jobs are at stake, products are at stake, customers use the products and love them. And if you break the company and they can't do that anymore, you're actually having a bigger impact than just the company itself. So I had to sit down and figure out what every single person at the company did and why they did that, and how what they do matters to the company, so that we can incorporate that into the decisions I was making. There's a very boring subject matter called transfer pricing. And we had, a company in the US, we had a company in Germany, and one of the companies we bought was in the US. So we had now IP sitting in one country and IP sitting in another country. You have to understand what that means, or you can make bad mistakes. And so I spent a lot of time, if you weren't confident in yourself, you might criticize me as being a micromanager, but I think the team that we had didn't see it that way at all. We sat down and we looked at every single decision we were making and tried to improve upon that area of the business so that things would run smoother, that we can automate things more, that we can make better decisions as a group. And through that process, I learned, more than I could ever imagine, more than I would have learned if I went to school for this. If you realize what every person does at the company and how to help them do their job better, then the company itself can get much better. When you joke about things that as a CEO, you have to be careful. And I'm one, my kids would tell you I make horrible jokes, but I find them funny. So when you talk about what's my favorite role at a company, the easy answer would be, the programming one, but that's actually not true. I think my favorite is probably product managers. And they'd understand this because program managers, product managers, they make everything run smoothly, or they should at least. That's their effort. And the hardest thing about keeping a company moving is getting things done on schedule, and having program managers managing that and product managers staying on top of what they have to do. It's the rhythm of the business is the most important. Back when we were working on Premiere, Adobe leadership came down to us at one point and said, tomorrow we're going to change the way the company does business. We're going to switch from selling a version every 18 months, either as an update or as a new version, and we're going to start selling subscriptions. And none of us knew what it was at the time. When I was asked to lead Maxon, one of the conversations that came up was, can we do with Maxon what Adobe did with subscriptions? And a lot of people, when they think about subscriptions, they just think about the way to make money. If we can always take money from our customers, then it's better money making than if we take customers' money once a year. That is true, and that's not something to not take serious. But the interesting thing about subscriptions, and I think one of the reasons that my team was trusted to go about and do that at Maxon, is when you look at subscriptions, it's not a financial model. It's not about just selling your software constantly. It's about changing the way the company works. And if you go back to a traditional perpetual and upgrade model, or a perpetual and service agreement model, every 18 months or every 2 years, you need to go out to a customer and sell them something new. You need to put a new thing in it. You have to create something new that they're going to spend money on. But that might not be what they want. They might not need new things. They might not need new features. But you're doing that because that's what the sales cycle demands of you. However, if you become a subscription company and you do it for real as a company, you change the relationship with the customer. You're not saying, what can I build for you such that you'll pay me more money? What you're doing is saying, what can I build for you such that you stay a customer of mine? They're already a customer of yours. They're already paying you. And you have to change the way you talk to them. You don't want to sell them something new anymore. You want to work with them and understand their problems even more intimately, and saying, you've paid me this month, you've paid me this year. What am I going to do for you next year so that we can maintain that trust, that we can maintain that relationship? And so you don't have to create these monster new features that you can make advertisements for to get someone to go on and spend more money. You just have to give them what they need. And they could be small features. They could be small, easy, life-improving features. Save the person using the software a minute a day, make them happier, make them smile, make it crash less. Things that would be hard to put on a feature list if you were selling new software. So when we switched Maxon to subscription, it wasn't about just changing the billing pattern for our customers. was about how do we rebuild the company to design the features such that our customers stay our customers, as opposed to just constantly selling them new software every year. And it's a fundamental shift for a company. It's critical. I think we've done a pretty good job at it. And I think your customers appreciate it that you're working so closely with them to build the features they need. I think the biggest thing we've noticed, especially as some of the traditional segments we serve slow down a little bit, we are realizing how many other people are looking at our software. I think architects and the construction industry is a huge area where people are shifting very dramatically towards digital storytelling. And I think that's going to help Maxon be very successful in that space. I think the coolest thing for us, though, is it's not just architects and construction, which is where our current focus is moving forward, but we see all sorts of industries starting to realize that 3D storytelling is critical. We're getting lots of jewelry designers, or even currency designers, or medical visualizations, product designers. So many people are starting to really dig into 3D as that new storytelling methodology, and I think it's going to make Maxon very successful in the future. If we look back at the last few years with the writers and artist strikes and in general the changing media landscape, you have to be able to, as a company, say, where are new opportunities? What can we do differently? And the good thing about a company like Maxon is you have this great amount of technology sitting around. And 3D creation tools, while we focused on TV and film in the past, they're going to be useful in any industry in the future, or almost any industry. So looking out into the future and finding new customers is critical. So knowing that, Nemetschek is our parent company, knowing that we have companies that operate right in the architecture space, we can actually leverage that. So Maxon has a very big architecture business in, say, Japan and Italy historically, but how can we take the technology that we have, which is this great 3D software, and then go to a different area where people maybe don't do as much visualization as they should, and bring them a new tool set? So sitting down and talking to the different teams at Maxon, but also the teams at the other companies within Nemetschek, and figuring out what the needs are, it's actually relatively easy to take your technology, and if you're careful about it, retarget it to a new industry and then be successful. So we're going to be taking our film software and then bringing it to be accessible so that more architects can tell their stories through visual means, not just through CAD software, but through full quality photorealistic renderings and walkthroughs based on all of our expertise in the film industry. In the last 2 or 3 years, I've had the opportunity to work directly with a couple architects on a couple different projects. And I think the description of the intent is almost identical between an architect and a filmmaker. How do you go about describing what the outcome is, and how do you communicate between being the customer of this outcome or the producer of it as an architect? I think where things are a bit different is that currently, at least with the architects I've worked with, the ability to use computer software to tell an artistic story, fully with full featured rendering and real interactive storytelling isn't as quite understood as it could be. I think they're trained more often still in the physical aspect of the architecture, on the drawings, on the plans, on the statics. And I think there's a lot of opportunity to realize how much power the computer and the software can bring to tell the story even more creatively. And I think when you tell something creatively to someone, especially someone who can't visualize a building, you have the ability to communicate much more early on. And I think that's where we can build that bridge more between someone who's used to telling a story visually and someone who's used to telling a story with plans or with drawings, as opposed to using the full power of 3D creation. Whenever I talk to Maxon or even our customers, I talk about our strategy being helping artists be more creative. And that encompasses everybody who's using our software. If you're using some sort of visual tool set or audio tool set, and you're going to tell a story, you are an artistic person, you're a creative person. And so when we when we added, architects as a core area that we wanted to focus on, it's clear to me that fits our Maxon customer segment, because what they're trying to do is build a new building to tell a story that might be something for an individual who's building a house. It might be for a company that wants to reflect back what they believe in. It might be to make a new area of a city beautiful, et cetera, et cetera. This is a creative storytelling based thing, so it fits our customer segment perfectly. Now, they might have been more traditionally using plans or discussions or pencil drawings, and we want to now enable them to use 3D software, from a rendering perspective to do that, but the clearly artistic intent in telling a story with a building. When you want to go about switching industries or targeting new customer segments, again, if you go back to the things we learned early on at Adobe, you can't assume you know what you're doing. You can't just say, oh, I can make a building look beautiful, so therefore our software will work just fine. You need to sit down with those customers and understand what they're doing. So it started off with me and one or two people from Maxon, but now most of the product team has to go out and talk to different people. So we're going to different trade shows where architects are present. We're going to meet the customers who use our sister company's products. We're going directly into architects' offices and trying to understand the problem sets. When we built the new headquarters for Maxon, they used Graphisoft for the renderings of the office, but we weren't happy with the quality of the renderings, so we sat down with the architects who were designing our own office, figured out what their workflows were, and tried to figure out how we can actually help them do things better. And again, if you're gonna create software for someone, you have to spend the time with them to understand their needs, because visualizing for an architecture company is very different than visualizing for a motion design company. One of the things we learned so far is when you're designing a commercial for a new shoe, or you're designing a commercial for a toy, you have sort of an extreme amount of artistic freedom within sort of the desires of the director and the story you're trying to tell, and things could be sort of fun and whimsical. When you're telling the story of a physical building, and you need to understand what's happening, when you're in the building, how are the people going to move around the building, there are differences. And so CAD models themselves are different than free-formed 3D objects, that are artwork. They actually have to have physical dimensions. They have to have different light behaviors. If you're sitting in the room I'm in here, there's 2 windows, glass doors between offices. That light's going to reflect different ways. You need to be able to show the materials on the chairs and the floor, or the kitchen has to be realistic. They have to be the right sizes. You need to be able to maneuver through them so you can understand how people would live inside of a building. These things are very specific in their storytelling versus more of a sort of marketing presentation that you might get from commercials or TV. There's a lot of similarities, but those differences sometimes make it more difficult. And you also have to work, in this case, you have to work directly with the CAD software, where we're the host when you're working in commercials. On the other side, the architect's going to be spending their entire day inside of CAD software, and so we have to then integrate with that. So there's a lot of differences, even though we can share a lot of the technology. Most of the customers of any company aren't going home after work and yelling and screaming on the internet. If you have to figure out how to hear what your customers are saying. And if you're working all day with someone's software, if you think about the software you use every day, be it Microsoft Word, Adobe Acrobat, or whatever, you're not giving them feedback every night. You're not just going on the internet and saying, oh, I can't type this the way I want to. So just listening to what you see as unfiltered feedback is only a very small part of the story. Usually the unhappy people yell and scream on the internet. The happy people are quiet. So it's about finding your way to the actual customers who are using your software to be successful, to make money, for their career choices. If they're going to use your software and they're using it 40 hours a week, you have to find time in their schedule to ask them feedback in a way that you can use to make the software better. And it's not easy. It's not a survey. It's not just reading unfiltered internet comments. You can't ignore that stuff, but you actually have to go to them, to their place of work, watch them work, be a part of them doing their job, sometimes participating if it helps, so that you can see what actually they do all day. And in doing that, you can find one little thing that might save them 2 hours, that might make them twice as happy. Or you might get in trouble because you made the software a little bit faster and they lose a coffee break. Those things have happened before as well too. But in general, go out with your customers and really go to their place of work, watch them use your software, and then work with them to make it better. About a year or two after I got to Maxon, We had just finished acquiring our second company. It was actually a merger, and we put two large companies together. It was very exciting. We had this whole integration plan. We had this whole idea on how we were going to get the two teams to work together. The second company was more American-based than Maxon was, and we had 3 months of planning of bringing different teams to different locations to help them work better together. And at that time, we started hearing rumors or news articles about, there was a virus in China, and we were working very closely with our Chinese partner, and we couldn't get them on the phone anymore. And very shortly after we couldn't get our Chinese partner on the phone anymore, we started having difficulty reaching our partners in Italy or in Spain, and we started getting really worried. And so we had to make the decision to actually shut down the office and send people home office. And at the time, that wasn't much discussed. I had talked to people at Nemetschek about it. They weren't taking it that serious, but we made the decision, having looked at everything that was going on with our business, that we had to send everybody home. And how do you make sure that your team is safe, that they're able to be productive? How do you get them home? And actually, what does it mean for after that? We spent a lot of time, even as we were moving people home, thinking about what kind of company do we want after we got out of this crisis situation. But we were very, very concerned that our industry might not survive. We didn't know what the impacts of Corona were going to be. We sat down every morning during that initial 3 months to look at our business performance to see, are we going to be able to pay the bills? We were a very young team. We had just put 3 companies together. We didn't know if it was an existential crisis or not. And so we spent an enormous amount of emotional effort to make sure, one, that we can make the company succeed, and two, that we can make sure our employees were safe, that they were productive, that they were able to go about being their job in lockdown. Earlier this year, we've had a lot of challenges at Maxon, but most of them were actually, apart from maybe Corona, they were all sort of normal day-to-day business challenges, things we had to adjust for, things we had to change. At the beginning of this year, one of our suppliers called us up and told us they weren't going to pay their bills anymore, and they were going insolvent, and part of the software we used to run our business wasn't going to work anymore. And that was a moment where I just wasn't really prepared for something like that to happen. We should have probably had more redundancy in place early on, but it wasn't something that we considered. It was a very large partner. It wasn't some small company that we were working with, and them going insolvent was, absolutely critical. We couldn't run our web shop anymore. We couldn't sell our software to our customers anymore. If we didn't react correctly, our software would actually turn off for our customers. So we had to put a crisis team together and work day and night for 3 weeks to make sure that, one, we can keep the lights on, and two, being able to sell our software again. The team is amazing. I think we're actually very good at working together in crises. This one was a very serious challenge. And again, when you think about being in the position of CEO, I think the biggest fear, I'd hope the biggest fear for other people in my shoes, is that somehow you're going to make a decision that's going to screw up, and you're not going to be able to keep your employees employed anymore. And that sort of fear is always back there. You're making lots of decisions. You're trying to move really fast, and people's livelihood, the job they love, the work they love doing, and the customers love the product. You don't want to screw that up. And I think that was one where we all felt as a team that that was the biggest challenge we had to deal with. Now, luckily, we were able to come together and get it done. The team's spectacular. But that was one crisis where I wasn't sure we'd make it through. When the crisis happened, we were able to all sit together in one room. And we have built a lot of trust at Maxon. I think anybody at Maxon feels the ability to call up myself or anybody else on the leadership team and talk to it. We're not a small company anymore. We're not a large company. But I think the leadership team is very accessible. So we 3 of us got together. Actually, a few of the leaders flew out to headquarters, and we sat down with the team and we explained to them exactly what was happening, exactly how critical it was, and built the trust in that first moment that they realized that this is something they had to also believe needed to be fixed, that they saw the impact on their daily lives, on what it meant for them. And I think they actually, appreciated the trust we showed in them to explain to them what was going on, and then to ask them for help. And then, for those, multiple weeks where we did that, we spent a lot of time together in person, pizza and occasional beer. And building that teamwork, I think, there was actually a lot of pride for everybody involved to want to solve the crisis. And they didn't feel like, I think, extra work for them. I think they actually came out of it feeling like they actually succeeded and did something very important. Every year we go back and make a trailer of all the cool stuff that our artists make. I mean, it's everything. You see, Legos running around and being animated. You see the best movies in the world. You see the most creative architecture, the most creative stories being told with our software. I think that one of the things that was sort of more intriguing is there's a very unique thing about Maxon software is they have plugins for it that allow you to bring in medical visualization. And so during that Corona crisis, most of the time when you're watching the news and seeing the animations of the coronavirus itself, most of those were visualized with our software. And so at the heart of it, when I go back to when I started in video or, today at cinema, the most meaningful things to me, apart from just the artistic intent, is when unique stories get told that hopefully make the world a better place, when people use the tools to tell documentaries, to tell new science, to explain things that people didn't see before, whether it's the coronavirus or a lot of the nature shows in Germany are created with our software. Anytime that we're using it to help people learn more, to understand more, I think there's a special pride there. But in general, I think all of the artistic intent is just fun to watch. Every single person at Maxon helps make a product. At some companies, they refer to people who aren't in the product division as G&A, general administrative, and it makes me very sad. It's something I completely disagree with. If you're sitting in finance and you're working with our customers or you're working with the managers who are doing a budget, you need to know why you're here. What are you doing? You're not just, processing bills or paying bills. You're actually trying to make the company more successful, and the company's mission is to serve their customer, and in our case, the customer is an artist. So whether you're in finance, whether you're in legal, whether you're in HR, it doesn't matter. You need to understand the mission of the company because you're part of the solution. You're part of helping get our story and our products out to our customers. Every single person matters, and every single person is helping to create, in our case, software for artists. If you think about artists or finance people or programmers, you might actually think that there might be conflict or they might not see the world the same way. And obviously in some ways they're very different, but actually in the most part when people are working together, an artist and a programmer or a programmer and someone in finance or HR, generally everybody goes to their place of work, the thing they're trying to achieve, and they're just going to solve a problem. If you're an artist, the problem is, how do I tell my story? How do I tell the story of the product I'm trying to represent? How do I tell the story of a building to the person who's receiving the building? And if you're a programmer, you're saying, how do I solve the problem of building this software for this artist? So there's much more common ground than I think we naturally would think about. And just helping people understand that common ground is there and how to communicate around that common ground. Once that's solved, then I think they work really well together. Going from either working with a small team or working in a big organization or to a company that's growing constantly, and then becoming sort of CEO, I think sometimes early on, I didn't realize the weight it carried as being CEO. And so I'd still go into meetings and behave just like Dave, Dave the programmer, Dave the leader of a small team. And I'd ask questions the way I always would have, not realizing sometimes the weight that was behind the position I'm in. And at times I was trying to ask just a lighthearted or maybe, even making a joke, and not realizing that, from some people who maybe just started the company, people who didn't know me yet, they were saying, oh, that's the CEO. This is, I don't know how to respond to what he's saying. I don't know how to answer him directly. Is that a joke? There is this concept that you have to be aware that you are the CEO and that, what you say doesn't always come across the way you intend it to be if you're just trying to be just that person that just walks down the hallway. I think understanding the difference of when you're the manager and when you're just someone in the room can get you in trouble at times. The biggest challenge when a company grows in general is if you're a group of 5 people trying to get something done, You can talk to each other all day long and just work together and not have any communication problems. As the company gets bigger, we've grown 3 times in employee count since I've been here, much bigger than that in the amount of software we ship or the finances we make. And as the company grows, communication is a huge problem. If people don't know what's going on the other side of the business, then that will slow them down. If they know too much what's going on the other side of the business, that will slow them down. Finding that balance is something about changing what you do all the time. You have to try to bring in more processes so you can help people understand what's going on to make the right decisions, but at the same point, that will slow them down. So the biggest thing you can do is talk to people. Constantly talk to the employees, walk around the office, visit the different areas where people are working, ask them what they're doing, find out what's upsetting them. You probably can't solve all the problems, but at least if you're aware of the problems, then you can try to slowly, make things better. If I looked back, or if I was to tell someone else what to expect with CEO, I think we've all heard it. There's sort of a loneliness. Lonely at the top is something that's said. I'm not sure that I'd go with lonely, but there's truth in the sentiment when you are responsible at the end of the day for the decisions you make, and if you understand what that actually means, what could potentially go wrong if you don't make the right decisions. You don't leave this job. You're thinking about it constantly, there's a weight with being CEO. And going back to the mentor of mine who is supposed to be CEO, he often calls me up and asks how I'm doing, because it's sort of a constant weight that you carry, the responsibility of making sure that your employees, that your company is successful. I think that's very hard to understand before you have that responsibility. And I think it's often described as lonely at the top. I don't think it's loneliness, but I think there's a weight of constantly having the responsibility for everything around you that makes it it's a great job, but it's also, it's exhausting at times. If I had to say I was one thing, I'd be a product person. I think one person once criticized me as in a board meeting or in some senior leadership situation. They said, "You're just a programmer." And I don't know that it was understood correctly, but I took that as a compliment. I love being the CEO that it's a product person. I love going down and understanding why we're talking to our customers, why we're building the product we do, because that is still where my heart is the product side of things. But again, everybody at Maxon is part of the product team. I joke a lot about the book I'm going to write, and I'm too lazy to write it, but I have written the chapters. After I said yes to the position, but before I started, I went on the internet and tried to buy CEO for Dummies. And it didn't actually exist. I'm not sure if it does today, but at the time it didn't exist. There was no book for CEOs who didn't know they were going to become CEOs. So CEO for Dummies was the title of my career. Even though things at times are very hard, either at Adobe or at Maxon, I think my entire career has followed the path it's supposed to. I wouldn't change anything. I think I've been very lucky to have the opportunity I've had, and the team at Maxon is spectacular. And when I get to spend my time on Maxon problems, it's a very great way to spend my time.